There you go, now it's time to board on to Chairman Drek's flagship. There you go.
Drex.
Surprisingly easy to board. I honestly, when I first played, thought that there'd be like a preliminary level of having to shoot your way through to it.
Considering this vessel was in this particular ship was something that Ratchet stole from the space station where he fought Quark, maybe they did the classic, it's an old clone but it checks out.
I was just thinking that when you started to talk about that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, this part I don't remember from the remake because I played it still a bit while ago. But I seem to remember that the remake adds like a small part where you actually have to arrive at the base. Technically it's Drek split, but if you saw the movie you know exactly what different it is then, just without having to tell spoilers.
It might be. It's been a while since I played it, but I guess to be fair, not all the changes that game made were bad.
No, like I said, for example, like I already mentioned, you know, the actual on-foot boss fight with Quark, for example.
And I'll admit, admittedly, if we were basing it strictly off of just the gameplay, yeah, it probably would just be a net game from the original. The problem is, well, it's one of those rare cases where a story is enough to turn people off from a game, even with good gameplay.
Because the game was rushed, you know, because Insomniac was practically ambushed and told, oh, you have to do basically a tie-in, which, you know, is basically a remake of the first game. Several of the content of this first game was actually cut away, like a good chunk of the minor planet that Ratchet and Clank
visits. So, sadly, there were some gameplay downgrades. It really is frustrating. Like, again, you would think that Sony, of all people, would know the folly of doing a movie tie-in game. Alright.
It's ironic, they didn't see the make the movie.
Well, it's like, did it really have to come out around the same time as the movie?
Again, tie-in stuff, so... Again, and the best part about it, Jova, I don't think it's still applicable anymore. I don't think so, at the very least. But at least when the game came out, people who recorded it, I know because the Italian video game YouTuber that I've been following for a very long time suffered from this. Since the actual cutscenes in that game are, not all of them, but most of them, are taken from the movie, you also get the copyright not strikes, but claimed by Universal for those. They're not property of Sony for being a Sony IP, but because they're considered clips from the movies, they count as equal of those Disney FMVs that you get in Disney Interactive games.
That's right, because that game was technically a tie-in to the movie instead of being a straight-up remake.
Okay, in true Insomniac fashion, it kind of starts after the events of the movie, and it's justified as being an unreliable retelling of the events by Quark's account, which, yeah, kind of makes it work, and is that kind of traditional, you know, Insomniac type of humor. So at the very least, they tried to work with what they had. It's just that, again, unfortunate circumstances and all, and the absence of TJ Fixman is very felt.
Like, I'll give Insomniac credit. On their lesser-than-great success stories are the ones that just feel bad. Typically, that's usually not their fault, but them just working with what they were told to do, essentially. So, I don't really fault them too much about the reimagining. Now, granted, I don't know how much say they had in the story department or whatnot, but, okay, to be fair, the game is, like, meant to be an adaptation of the movie, so I guess we can't even really blame them fully for how the story bits got messed up, because that was strictly the movie's own doing. Which is a weird case. I have to wonder, had that game been successful, would we have then gotten a new timeline for Ratchet and Clank that's essentially originating from the movie?
Possible. If I had to guess, probably. Maybe that was the plan.
Yeah, like, not just that, but I wonder if they would have essentially used that reimagining as a reboot to basically start all anew.
Which would, okay, again, that's a speculation, but if so, it kinda would have been, you know, not distasteful, but kind of like that, considering, as we mentioned, Nexus did end with a cliffhanger that, yes, Rift Apart picked on apart, but the story is still not done. Again, if the next game that is supposedly come out, thanks to the data set, finally manages to conclude that plot point, and then Insomniac decides to finally retire the franchise or make it another new reboot, then I will actually be more willing to understand. Even for the potential is infinite, at the very least, that would mean having a sense of closure, on things.
And I guess I have to give Insomniac credit. Like, unlike a lot of cartoony scrimblow bimblow franchises, Insomniac stuck with Ratchet and Clank. Now, part of that is due to the fact that they had the chance, because let's not forget...
Also, as we mentioned towards the beginning, Jova, as Pedro noted, this franchise is also possibly the highest seller of the cartoon trinity of the PS2 era.
That is true, yes.
So it was also a monetary gain and everything.
Yeah, because Go on.
One benefit is that, unlike, say, Crash, Spyro, or a lot of other games, Ratchet and Clank got to stay with Insomniac the whole time. Now, I'm not saying that no one can ever, take the reins of a franchise. We've seen that happen before.
Well, even for this franchise, the PSP games were done by a completely different team. Huh?
True, but they still at least have, like, the main console games being held by Insomniac. Like, one thing I've noticed is that what led to a lot of cartoony platformer franchises' downfalls was a change in management, or rather a change in dev hands. Not saying that that's always the case, but you notice, as soon as Naughty Dog left the building with Crash, well, okay, to be fair, we got Crash Bash and that one was fine, but, like, main platformer-wise, we got Rapid Cortex. That was
Well, that was mostly Vivendi. I think it was them at the time, really not knowing what to do with the franchises. Either that, or being PC, and rushing things out,
That is true, though I do get the feeling...
Yeah, that's what happened with Enter the Dragonfly.
To be perfectly honest, considering, remember, the Jack 4 was originally being made by the Last of Us team before they scrapped that because it wasn't turning out good enough. That they were steering way too far from what the franchise was, and that's why they made The Last of Us Part 1. And to be perfectly honest, in hindsight, yeah, it's for the best that we didn't get a Jack and Daxter game made by Neil Druckmann. So.
Oh boy.
One can only dream or have an nightmare more life.
If Jack 4 was going to be made by him, then maybe it's for the best we didn't get it after all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of funny because Jack 3 kind of has elements about, not necessarily blue balling about revenge, but something close to that. So, who knows?
I guess we can at least claim that the racing game for Jack admittedly tied the series.
I still have a soft spot also for The Lost Frontier, even though he's not particularly liked by a lot of people. I still have to play the proper Daxter spin-off, but that has been ever since, added to the backwards compatibility program, so it's only a matter of time before I give my try on it.
Yeah. No, Daxter is already there. Lost Frontier, the PSP version is there, and that's actually the better version because you'd think the PS2 version would be better, but if you actually look it up, and I did, when they put it to the PS2, they screwed up some stuff.
Not just with that, Pedro. Apparently, also with the Ratchet and Clank spin-offs. For some reason, the PSP version conversions to the PS2 formats, were surprisingly garbage ports, and I don't know why.
Yeah, that's why the recent classics are only putting up the PSP version, and it's for the better, honestly.
I typically go with the idea that the racing game is the end of the chronology.
No, Lost Frontier happens afterward.
Yeah, technically Lost Frontier is, yes.
And even then, story-wise, strictly, it's still relatively end-open, because it essentially was made to open up, a new set of, adventures where Jack and Daxter explore the future to see if there are traces of Eco.
I feel like, that's the kind of open-ended ending that you can at least end a franchise on.
Yeah, I still would have loved to see more, but, I'm not super in a hurry compared to stuff like, Sly.
Oh God, Sly. Okay, Sly, I think, is one of the
As
worst.
Deji also put it, he's still stuck in Egypt since 2013.
It's because
Damn.
that was a big mistake on part of Sanzor to end that particular game on a cliffhanger, because they had to know that there was no guarantee.
Well, like I said, Pedro, supposedly there was supposed to be the conclusion in Egypt as DLC, but because of a stupid mandate that the PS Vita and PS3 version had to be equal in content, we could not make it, apparently. So,
I guess
it's still stupid at the end of the day, and honestly, again, I already mentioned that the solution is not really to ignore that freezing time happens, but build up on them. But at this point, I don't even know who can actually handle it, especially considering that these days, because of, events that transpired in 2024, Sony is kind of having the equivalent of a chicken running without its head moment. So we probably need to wait a bit before recuperating. I mean, again, Team Asobi has demonstrated that they can potentially, differentiate in different, not genres, but variations of our platformer works. So again, theoretically they can handle everything if it's put on them. It's just that who knows what's gonna happen with them later.
To go back to what Jovo was saying about the whole retirement of these franchises, it's one of those things where it's just like, at the end of the day, let's face it, for as much as we don't like it, money is always the bottom line at the end of the day. For as much as we don't, you can say you don't like that, but that doesn't change the fact that it is a fact.
Look, I am perfectly willing to admit that, yes, while the idea is to entertain and let the arts flourish, at the end of the day, a company's, even if it's not their main goal, a company does need to make money to survive. So even on like a non-greedy route, I do get worries when products aren't selling, essentially.
It's like, I'm not necessarily about to bring up that point. It's more so a fact of that executives typically look at sales figures and decide on these things. That's typically how it works. Because, like I said, and again, this is something that fans of these games don't like hearing, but again, it's the truth is the truth. If you actually look up the sales figures of these games, you'll realize that the Sly games in particular didn't really sell. One of the free Sly games from the PS2 sold over 1 million, but the other ones didn't even crack 1 million. The truth of the matter is that the Sly games, probably because they weren't very well marketed at the time, didn't sell all that great. And same thing with the Jack games, surprisingly. You'd think, but they're Naughty Dog games. Of course, it's not surprisingly, no. If you actually look up the sales figures, not really. But the Ratchet games, those actually sold. Like I said, if you actually look up the sales figures, the PS2 games alone for Ratchet sold way more than the entirety of the Jack and Daxter franchise. So and quadruple of the Sly franchise.
Also, up until last year, I would have just not say anything after that. But after this, at this point, it really is like beating a dead horse on the matter. And yet, all of that would have still sold more than Concord did. So again,
obviously.
My point being that a lot of times, even Lidl still has a more, of a significance when wasting a lot of money on what you think is actually relevant.
That's to my point. The reason Sony is now in panic mode, canceling live service games left and right, is because the failure of Concord completely destroyed their plans, basically.
Okay. Like, I want to build off of Tio's point here. Yes, some of those platformer games weren't selling as well, but there are other factors to consider. One of them being that they didn't cost nearly as much to make as a lot of the MMOs Sony's been pumping millions and probably soon to be billions of dollars into, essentially. Like, they had budgets that arguably they fit. And in that, they also added a sense of variety. And with that variety came reasons to buy the consoles, essentially. Like, I feel like part of Sony's issue was looking at things in the short term, like just, this one series isn't making a gazillion dollars, but not considering how there was a bit of a ballooning effect here and there, that the series together were profitable, essentially, as long as you kept the fan base nice and consistent. Which is, okay, that's a thing. one thing that even the Scrimble Wimble platformers had that
Oh. Turns out
Surprise,
Chairman
I'm
Drax
not here.
Yeah, it's actually worse because the planet Cracker is actually complete.
Witness the power, the destruction, and the nothingness that follows. So join
And of course, the primary target, since they were already in orbit, is Veldin.
One world and begins another.
where
Then,
Drek
stay tuned for the
himself is
galaxy's
on.
funniest superhero
Well,
bloopers
as we
featuring
will actually
Captain
see, you
Quark.
know, he knows what he's doing.
Now we know where he is. Let's get him.
Alright, well, go on while the party's finishing, brother.
Like, again, while some of these live service games sell great at the start, the problem is they end up being failures because people don't stick around for them long enough for the plan to milk them as live service games go into. Like, say what you will about how maybe little these sales were, but these sales, you know, maintained their purpose. Like, and I feel like the companies realized that up until the generation where we started to see cartoony platformers being traded in for more realistic
Speaking
games,
of,
or
here's our homage to our porn gym. Actually, no, more like the Neverhood, because I think it was done. You know,
Yeah, I think
this one.
I think this is more
cute.
something like
No, because
you
again,
know-
Neverhood has a sequence where the protagonist kind of does something similar. Go on, brother.
I'll just say this, it's gonna be interesting if Sony, you know, in realization of how the live service thing doesn't work, are going to scramble and then kind of overcorrect by trying to go back to the good old days, since, shock of all shocks, their single-player games have been arguably doing better in the long run.
Again, Jova, there are a lot of arguments to be made and speculation tied to the video game industry as a whole, because at this point, almost everyone is just a giant question mark, you know, due to events that are happening. But again, for the purpose of this game, tune in for the next part for the epic conclusion back on Ratchet's Onward of Veldin. See ya.
See ya.
Ta-ta!
Bye.